There is nothing we cannot accomplish.
What I told the people of the state throughout the campaign is I intend to go down to Washington to be the best congressman that I can be from the state of Vermont. As I was out on the campaign trail, if I heard it once, I heard it 100 times. Bernie, you go down there and you give him hell. And that is exactly what I intend to do.
Bernie's run for mayor begins with his leaving the Liberty Union Party.
In '71, I kind of stumbled onto a meeting of a group called the Liberty Union Party.
This third party had people who were interested in economic justice and anti-war activists. And
I think there were 40 or 50 people in the room, and I had never been to a meeting in my entire life, and I ended up leaving as the candidate for the United States Senate.
He had this crazy hair, campaigned next to a VW Beetle, didn't have 2 nickels, and would run for, the U.S. Senate, and would get, 1% of the vote.
I was very poor at the time, but I remember giving to the Sanders campaign. He was a candidate for Liberty Union. I would give him $5 a month out of a very small check. So I was a firm believer.
After having run for office 4 times as a third-party candidate.
Finally, I think it was in '76, I said, hey, enough is enough, and I'm not going to get involved anymore. And
Richard Sugarman, kind of an advisor to Bernie, convinced him that running for local office instead of running for national office was a better way to begin.
The thing I liked about him is that he was not an academic political guy. Like he didn't talk much about theory. He talked about getting things done, and I liked that.
Good evening. My name is Bernard Sanders. We are going to be looking at poverty in Vermont, the economic misery, totally unnecessary in my view, that is grinding down the lives of tens of thousands of Vermonters.
He was saying all the right things. He was anti-war, he was pro-union, he was pro-woman, he was a very strongly pro-choice candidate, always has been.
Too many women have fought for too many years to make sure that women control their bodies, not the government.
And he was a person that I wanted to support. But he also appeared reasonable. He didn't appear hugely dogmatic like some of the other political thought of the day.
Ruth, you're a volunteer worker at the old North End food co-op here in Burlington.
Right, around disability, Social Security.
You got cut from $131 to?
$48.
And what was the justification for that? How do they expect you to live on the difference?
No, they don't care.
And he stood for a kind of democratization of politics in America, which was desperately needed.
And I think Sugarman, more than perhaps Bernie himself, recognized that it was a political system that had kind of decayed in Burlington.
I did encourage Bernard to run for mayor of Burlington in the fall of 1980.
Of course, we all understood that Bernie was a socialist. He had been an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party only months before in the 1980 election. But he didn't run as a socialist. He ran as a person who was going to let people participate in government, that was not going to let the city be sold out.
There was a virtually monolithic government in Burlington, Republican and Democrat. I mean, even though the incumbent mayor, Paquette, was a Democrat, he was certainly supported by the Republicans.
Gordon Paquette had become the leader of the Democratic Party. Then in 1971, he became mayor and was mayor throughout the rest of the 1970s. But in Burlington, Democrats were really like Republicans. They were very business-oriented. They really were a conservative establishment that was really resistant to change and resistant to ideas coming from the outside. It was kind of clannish. The members of the city council would meet in the mornings in Nectar's restaurant, and they would sit around the table and they would decide what was going to happen that night at the city council meeting. Paquette felt that he understood people, but as time went on, he became less and less responsive to local needs.
Women's groups who really had no opportunity up to that time to get access to City Hall, low-income people. who were worried about the condition of low-income housing in the city, young people who wanted an opportunity to be involved. We were able to put together a coalition of folks like the Burlington Patrolmen's Association, the Policemen's Union, environmental groups, who had great concerns about what was happening in the city at that time.
And so Bernie was someone who could be a voice for all of them.
What I think needs to happen now is for there to be public debate as to how much money the people of Burlington are prepared to spend.
He knocked on every door, talked to everybody. He doubled the turnout, in effect.
Paquette didn't really take him seriously at first, refused initially to debate him, and I think it finally came through to him very clearly at the Unitarian Church 1 or 2 weeks before the election. He had finally been forced to have a debate with Bernie. And he said, if Bernie Sanders is elected, Burlington's going to become like Brooklyn. And people hissed at him. They actually hissed at him. And when Bernie said something, there was wild applause. And yet still, Paquette and all the people around him felt absolutely confident that he was going to win that election handily. Nobody thought Bernie was going to win until he did.
He was surprisingly elected by 10 votes.
Many people in Burlington are still in a state of shock following that city's most stunning political upset in memory last month. Bernard Sanders, one of the founders of the Liberty Union Party and a consistent loser in previous quests for elective office, was now the big winner. Considered by many to be unelectable because of his so-called radical views, Mr. Sanders put together an unlikely coalition of supporters and edged the 10-year incumbent Gordon Paquette.
And now Bernie's mayor of Burlington, and it's a major national story because we've just inaugurated Ronald Reagan, the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge, and here the largest city and the historically most Republican state in the Union has just elected a socialist as mayor. So the juxtaposition of Reagan and Bernie was just a natural story that these guys, had to run with.
Oh, it was more than a shock to the system. It was as though Trotsky had become mayor of Burlington. He put out statements to try to reassure the more conservative elements of the city that the changes would be reasonable changes. It did not quell the anxiety of some of the really conservative members of the city who were very influential in running it.
The point here is a real dilemma. It was interesting.
Bernie's election by the landslide of 10 votes in 1981 surprised most folks, and the prevailing attitude at the time was, let us just batten down the hatches and this will pass. This was a fluke election, and if we could hang on for 2 years, we'll be back to the good old days when the Democrats reign.
Bernie Sanders was abused by the establishment Democrats who were convinced it was a fluke.
For months, they wouldn't let him appoint anybody. It was all obstruction because they could not accept the idea that he'd been elected.
Because they felt very threatened by the fact that this outsider who was talking about change and shaking things up and bringing a lot more people into the process of city government.
It was a very hostile environment, there's no question. Particularly the old guard Democrats on the Board of Aldermen at the time were very resistant to anything that Bernie supported. So they did everything that they could do to throw up barriers to Bernie making progress. So the first year was very rough.
He really didn't know much about local issues at this point. He admitted that. He said, I really am focused on national and international issues. But he was a good listener.
Gene, what's happening to the people here in the north end of Burlington?
Well, most of the people in the north end are working class people.
And Burlington became much more open environment for all sorts of people.
2 years later, Bernie Sanders wins by a big margin.
With more than 50% of the votes. So what had begun as a fluke was obviously not a fluke.
Unfortunately, second time they really went after him. Socialists destroying Burlington, they're bad for business.
I think they made a mistake by the red baiting and by attempting to marginalize Bernie. And as a result, I think support for Bernie and his agenda grew.
The victory that we won tonight
is in fact not only a victory for Burlington, I think, it's a victory for the United States of America.
Bernie did not run for mayor of Burlington as a socialist. He ran as an independent. And as far as I can remember, he never used the word socialist. He was running on a good government agenda. But once he became mayor and it became known that he was a socialist, he got a lot of publicity.
Whatever he was not a very radical socialist. He was kind of a socialist minimalist, I would say. The day before the second election, I remember he called me up. He said, "Did you see the Wall Street Journal today? Front page, socialist, good for business in downtown Burlington," which I thought was great. And so that took some of the sting, at least at a later stage, out of these scurrilous assaults.
So long as I, at least, am mayor of the city of Burlington, I intend to see the development of the waterfront take place in a people-oriented way.
Housing, waterfront development, and transportation became his campaign themes.
With decent wages and decent working conditions, the willingness to stand up against the mighty and the powerful.
I covered him throughout the 80s. And Bernie Sanders was preaching the same thing. Concentration of wealth in this country is getting worse and worse.
Grossly unfair distribution of wealth and power in this country, which is clearly the most single important issue, which has got to be raised for the future of this country.
It's outrageous that we have homeless people sleeping under bridges.
And you get people sleeping out all over the streets, all over America.
That public schools aren't funded, that we're going to war needlessly.
Talk about spending billions more for the military while we're cutting programs for the elderly and the sick and the homeless. And if we are the only community in the United States of America which is going to show a little bit of sanity, then so be it. We're proud of it.
What is remarkable about Bernie Sanders is that his message has been constant, but that he hasn't given up.
Bernie kept his promise to involve people in the process and running of government.
He knows that change starts at the bottom. Change works its way up.
He found it very gratifying, very rewarding, and it was hands-on. That's the part I think he liked the best.
They used to have something in Burlington called a spring fling, in which the students of UVM, when you could still drink at age 18, the last day of classes, they'd come downtown Burlington and they'd get drunk and literally trash the corner of Church and Main Street, right next to City Hall. And I was standing there watching it one year, and Bernie walked by. He was his first year as mayor, and he looked at me and said, "Come with me." And so we went into City Hall. We picked out a couple of plastic bags, and he said, "You're going to walk around with me and pick up broken glass." I was shanghaied by Bernie Sanders.
I am not a total fan of Bernie Sanders. I am not an unequivocal supporter. He's made mistakes, like all politicians do. But he's authentic. He doesn't curry favor. Maybe even his somewhat surly nature at times works in his favor because he doesn't seem like he's willing to pander.
But they're wrong to insist on that.
But I cannot disagree that his timing has been perfect and his message is true.
No matter what happens, the fact that people are coming together and working together to try to develop a better life for everybody is itself a major victory. We've won already.
He was in 4 terms. I think he felt he had done all that he could as mayor by that time. Many people forget how astonishing this was. We had had 8 years of Ronald Reagan as president. That also convinced me that in a country where Ronald Reagan could be president, Bernie could certainly be a congressman.
I will be the very best congressman from Vermont that I can be, and I thank you all very much for giving me that vote of confidence. Thank you all.
Production funding for Beyond Bernie was provided in part by 3 Hats Bookkeeping, Do you want to spend less time bookkeeping? Meet 3 Hats Bookkeeping. We pair you with a dedicated bookkeeping team. Each month, your team categorizes your transactions into accurate financial statements. Bookkeeping done for you.